In the quiet world long before ticking clocks and glowing screens, time drifted slowly through the branches of trees and the shadows of stones. It didn't count down in numbers or blink across devices. It was felt in the wind, seen in the stars, and heard in the still hush before dawn. People then didn't measure seconds or minutes. Instead, they waited for the sun to rise. They waited for birds to sing, for dew to settle, for the hush before night. Life was steady, and time moved like a slow river. Long ago, in a village without walls or roofs shaped by machines, a child awoke when the sky began to pale. Not because of an alarm, but because the birds had begun to whisper. The child blinked at the ceiling of woven reeds above and watched as soft golden light began to creep in. This was how morning began, not sharply, not suddenly, but gradually, like a dream fading into wakefulness. The villagers stirred in rhythm with this slow arrival of day. Each person understood time not as numbers on a dial, but as the feeling of light on their skin or the smell of damp earth warming under the sun. A mother watched the long shadows fade as she stretched her arms. She didn't need to know it was 7 o'clock. She only needed to know that the light was just right to begin preparing grain. Time, in those days, was a companion rather than a taskmaster. People didn't chase it. They moved with it, as one might drift with the tide. And the first great marker of time for ancient people was the sky. The sky changed with precision far beyond the ticking of any clock. Its patterns were dependable, and its face, though always shifting, was never random. When the sun climbed higher, shadows changed. A hunter resting beneath a tree could watch his own shadow shorten slowly, telling him it was nearly midday. No numbers needed, no dial, just the position of the light and the story it told on the ground. When his shadow vanished beneath him, he knew it was time to return home, not because of pressure or schedule, but because the sun, ever reliable, said so. The first teachers of time were these shadows. Trees cast long fingers in the morning, short stubs at noon, and again reached far across the grass in late day. These patterns became part of people's understanding. Children were taught not what the hour was, but how the light bent and what that meant. They learned from their parents and grandparents how to watch the sky, the trees, and even the animals. The birds, too, had their own rhythms. Some chirped only at dawn. Some flew high only in late morning. Some became quiet just before dusk. In this way, people came to know the flow of time by sound as much as by sight. A shepherd might know it was late afternoon not because of the sun, but because the bees had grown quiet and the sheep had begun to huddle together. As people began to settle in places for longer periods, they needed better ways to mark the passing of time. Not just the hours of the day, but the days themselves, the moons, the seasons, the years. And so they turned their eyes upward. The sky at night was a silent, endless map, and it held more knowledge than the earth ever could. The stars moved with majestic slowness, and with each new season, new constellations appeared. In the soft hush of early night, elders would sit outside and point to the stars for the young. They would tell stories of how certain stars only rose during the harvest, how others vanished before the floods came. These stories weren't just for wonder, they were for survival. When to plant, when to fish, when to gather, all of it depended on the sky's ancient and unchanging schedule. A boy once lay on a woven mat, his head in his grandmother's lap, as she traced patterns in the stars with her finger. She told him how their ancestors had followed those same stars across deserts and mountains, how one bright star always appeared near the coldest nights, how another cluster of lights, meant the rains were coming soon. The boy listened, not as if he were learning math or dates, but as if the sky itself were whispering secrets just to him. In caves and on cliffs, ancient people carved and painted what they saw in the sky. Some of these carvings, circular marks and repeating symbols, are believed by modern scholars to be early calendars, not of weeks or hours, but of cycles. The cycle of the moon, for example, became deeply important. Its waxing and waning became a soft, glowing pulse in the night sky, an ever-repeating reminder of change and rhythm. A woman kneeling beside a pond might see the full moon reflected and know it was time to prepare for a ceremony. Another, watching a thin crescent, might whisper a prayer for new beginnings. The moon, in all its gentle phases, told people when to act, when to rest, when to hope. No gears ticked inside it, no batteries, just the patient, eternal glide of its path through the sky. Eventually, people built stone circles and towers. They aligned these with the sun's rise and fall, with the moon's dance and the stars' slow march. These great silent monuments were not just sacred, they were tools. Tools to remember, to observe, to measure. At a certain day of the year, sunlight would pass through a specific crack in the stone. It meant the solstice had arrived. It meant winter would soon end or begin. People would gather in silence, watching that beam of light as if it were a message from the gods. But even without such structures, the land itself told time. Rivers swelled and shrank. Certain flowers bloomed only in certain weeks. A traveler far from home might read time from a blooming tree or a dry creek. He didn't need to ask what day it was. He could feel it in the breath of the wind and the warmth of the soil beneath his feet. The nights in those days stretched long and wide, not measured in hours, but in the settling of air and the way embers cooled in the hearth. When darkness fell, it was not a curtain pulled quickly. It was a soft closing of the sky. First the birds went silent. Then the colors faded, the trees darkened, and the stars began their slow, familiar reveal. One by one, the points of light filled the heavens. Not chaotically, not all at once, but patiently, as if they too were waiting to be noticed. People in those early times didn't glance at a device to know when to sleep. They didn't tap a screen to check how much of the night remained. They simply watched. They felt. They knew. And when sleep came, it was not stolen between tasks. It arrived like fog on a field, unrushed, unannounced, always welcome. Time wasn't a thing they chased. It was something that passed over them like a soft wind. A woman preparing food by the fire would stir the pot until the color deepened, not because a timer buzzed, but because the scent changed. She knew it was nearly done when the bubbles sounded heavier, when the smoke turned a softer gray, when the cat beside her shifted and blinked toward the door. It was in these little moments that time lived. A boy watching his father sharpen tools would learn not by counting the strokes, but by hearing when the scrape became smooth. When the metal hissed just right, that meant it was finished. No need to check a clock. The sound told everything. Time was a song then, with quiet verses and long pauses. Not a loud march of seconds, but a drifting lullaby. When the moon grew thin in the sky, it meant new things would begin. People marked this crescent not with urgency, but with reverence. New moons were days for planting, for reflection, for careful steps. And when the moon became full again, they gathered. Dances began. Food was shared. Stories were told. All not because of a calendar, but because the sky itself had turned its page. They didn't name weeks. They didn't need to. A mother could know how long a journey had been by how many moons she had seen. A hunter could know how far he had traveled by how many new smells he had walked through. A child might count the days since a celebration by how many times she had woken to the same songbird. Every moment was wrapped in a sense of continuity. Even fire became a clock. Some woods burned fast, others slow. A man tending the night fire knew how far the night had passed by how much of the log had turned to ash. He didn't rise to check. He simply listened to the crackle, felt the heat on his face, watched the glowing heart shrink and shift. It was enough. In some places, the trees told time. Certain leaves changed color in a rhythm so dependable that entire migrations happened in response. The rustle of falling leaves wasn't just a sign of change. It was a reminder that a cycle had turned again, that time had kept its quiet promise. In the wide valleys, shepherds counted the days by when the goats returned to a specific patch of grass. In the desert, travelers watched the shadows grow longer beside their camels and knew how much daylight remained without ever needing to ask. There was no timekeeping, only time feeling. And in this feeling, there was rest. There was no fear of being late, no anxiety about delay. If the river was too high to cross, they waited. If the stars had not yet reached their place, they rested. There was a wisdom in waiting, a patience modern clocks do not allow. A boy once sat beside a dying fire, his eyes half closed as his grandfather whispered a story of a mountain that breathed. The story was slow, meandering, like the mountain wind itself, and the boy, half asleep, felt as though the story and the time it passed through were one and the same. No ending needed, no sense of when the tale began or when it might conclude. It simply was, like time itself. Even celebrations were woven into natural rhythms. A flower that bloomed only once a year became the center of a festival, not because someone scheduled it, but because people watched. When it bloomed, they knew it was time to gather, time to dance, time to thank the earth for remembering its promise. The stars above were not numbers or data. They were memory, a way to remember stories, events, lessons. One star marked the time a great journey began. Another, the time a village was founded. People didn't just read the sky, they remembered through it. To forget time was never a danger, because time did not hide. It was in everything. In the slow sway of tall grasses, in the rhythm of waves against the shore, in the soft hoot of an owl only heard after the third hour of night, if that hour had a name at all. They didn't speak of early or late. They spoke of before the dew lifts, or after the long wind, or when the stars line up over the old cedar. And these phrases, while vague to us, were crystal clear to them. They didn't need seconds. They had seasons. They didn't need deadlines. They had moonlight. And in this, there was peace. The kind of peace that lets you listen longer, speak softer, move more slowly. Time wasn't money. It wasn't something to save or waste. It was something to walk with, like a quiet companion, always beside you. And if it slipped away, it didn't run. It faded like smoke. It settled like dust. It drifted like dreams. The moonlight had faded slightly, as though even the heavens were growing tired. In the hush that blanketed the ancient forest, the embers of the hearth dimmed, and time, whatever that meant, marched on, unnoticed and unmeasured by all but the soft gaze of the old ones. Among the people, silence was never truly silent. It came with the rustling of dried grass, the shifting of the wind through thin animal skins hung above doorways, and the gentle breath of sleepers curled together in warmth. They had no ticking clocks, no numbers spinning in circles above mantles. Time was in the air and earth, and still, they knew. As the stars moved, almost lazily, the villagers stirred without alarm. They lived not by bells, but by rhythm. The rhythm of hunger, the rhythm of cold, the rhythm of the stars and the tides and the shade of the moss on the side of the stones. In the earliest caves, deeper than the roots of trees, a slow thought began to stir. If the sun always came back, and the moon changed her face in a predictable dance, then surely, there was something to be known in her cycles. It was not a scientist who first counted the days. It was a mother who noticed the days between one full moon and the next were the same as the number of times she fetched water between her monthly bleedings. It was the child who watched his shadow grow tall in the morning and shrink at midday. It was the elder who remembered the winter always came after the third death of the leaves. Time wasn't something to chase. It was something to notice, something to sit with, like smoke curling slowly upward, like water freezing into silence. The sky was not merely a dome above, it was a scroll, an old story unrolling night by night. The stars were not decorations, they were gentle guides, each with a name known only to the storytellers who rarely spoke unless the sky asked for a tale. And so it was that time became a story whispered across generations, not recorded in ink, but etched in memory. A tale told not in hours and minutes, but in moons and harvests and the slow walk of constellations. The people built nothing that ticked, no cogs, no dials. They built only fires and circles of stones, each aligned with the breath of the season. At first, these stones were mere markers. This is where the sun sets when the deer return. This is where my shadow falls on the longest day. But over time, the markers turned into monuments, not grand, not decorated, just large stones placed where only the sky could explain their reason. And when the rains returned at the same place in the circle, year after year, they began to understand. The stones did not move, but the world did. This understanding was never shouted. It was folded into the long, dull rhythm of life. And so the first calendars were born, not in books, but in the soil. The people did not rush to mark each day. They marked seasons. They marked the return of light, the drying of berries, the bloom of certain flowers. These were their hours. These were their alarms. Some tribes began to use knotted cords, hanging from wooden frames. Each knot a day, each row a cycle. The knots were touched gently, reverently, like the pages of a sacred book. No one counted loudly. They only nodded when a certain knot came to hand. Time was not a command. It was a companion. The stars turned slowly above them. Time moved, yes, but never ahead of them. It moved with them, at their pace, under their gaze. The moon waned. The moon grew. The sun shifted his path inch by inch. And all the people did was watch and nod and remember. There were places, sacred and cold, where people laid bones in special rows, marked with ochre and shell. At first, it seemed merely ceremonial, but over time, patterns appeared. Each burial spaced in tune with the moon. The dead, too, kept time, and so they built cairns, small mounds of stone aligned with the sunrise on the shortest day. And when the light touched the center stone just once a year, they gathered, not to celebrate the day, but to honor the returning cycle. Time, to them, was not lost or gained. It was returned, like the tide, like a memory. And through this soft understanding, the world continued. In the quiet valleys, long before temples rose from stone, people watched shadows, not because they understood mathematics or geometry, but because they noticed. They noticed how their own silhouettes would shrink at midday and stretch like old tree branches in the early evening. A boy once placed a stick in the ground and marked the edge of its shadow with a small rock. The next day, he did it again, and again. Soon, a circle formed, not perfect, not symmetrical, but a record. The old ones didn't call it science. They called it waiting. Over the course of many moons, they understood that the sun, too, had a rhythm, that it climbed highest at the height of summer, and so began barely the slow over the edge of the world in winter. Not clocks, not calendars, but places where stone and sunlight met in stillness. One such circle, older than many can name, was laid where the light would hit a single marked spot only once a year, on the longest or shortest day. No celebration, no ceremony, just a nod, a whisper. The year has turned. In the cold north, where sunlight barely lingered, they learned to watch the stars instead. One by one, constellations would disappear below the horizon, and new ones would take their place. They charted these arrivals, quietly, patiently. Fishermen, wrapped in furs and silence, knew when to set their nets by the height of Orion. Mothers knew when the frost would bite deepest by the rise of certain stars just before dawn. Elsewhere, far across the snow and sea, the desert dwellers listened to the wind. They heard the call of distant sands and knew when the rainy season approached, not by smell or sight, but by the song of the dunes. They tied beads into strings, each bead a day, each color a season. It wasn't fast, it wasn't precise, but it was true. Even the elders, whose hands shook with age, could hold a string of days and feel how far they had come. When it rained, they did not curse the delay. They said, "It is the time of wet." When it dried, they said, "Now the time of sun has returned." No hours, no urgency, only awareness. Time was a soft drum in the background, not a bell to chase. In mountain villages, they watched the melting of snow. A trickle down a dark stone meant the beginning of spring. A rush meant planting must begin. When it slowed again, the growing season had passed. One woman, with deep-set eyes and skin like dry bark, kept feathers in a bowl, each feather from a different season, placed gently in its time. Children would ask, "When will the big rains come?" And she would run her fingers over the bowl and answer with only a gesture. A feather, placed higher than the rest. The time will come again. And it always did. Their stories were not dramatic. They did not speak of gods controlling the hours. They spoke of the earth breathing in slow patterns, of light and dark dancing forever. One tale told of a bird that only sang on the third morning after the last frost. No one heard the bird themselves, but they all believed. That belief became its own timekeeper. When someone heard a distant chirp, they nodded. It is the time of sowing. Not because the bird decided, but because the people had decided long ago to trust the rhythm. There were no mistakes in this world of time, only moments. Miss one, and another will return. All things repeat, eventually. A grove of trees, planted generations ago, held a secret. In the heart of the grove stood a single ancient tree, gnarled and leaning, with 7 notches carved deep into its trunk. one notch for each moon of the growing season. The villagers said that each time a full moon passed, a child would touch the notch with a finger dipped in ash. The color faded after a few rains, but the memory remained. There was no counting, not in the way we know it, just remembrance. In distant lands, a tide marked time better than a bell. The water came and it went, twice each day. The sea pulled back like breath, then returned again. Those who lived near its edge walked with that rhythm. They built small piles of shells on the rocks, one for each tide. Children were sent to count them in the morning, brushing the piles smooth and readying them again. Fishermen knew not to ask, "What hour is it?" but rather, "How many tides until the moon is full?" To them, the moon and the sea were family, speaking in whispers only the patient could understand. Far inland, where rivers curved like sleeping snakes, time flowed with the water. A tribe marked the year by the flooding of the river. When the bank spilled over, it was the beginning. The elders would gather beside the rising stream, watching silently. When the water touched a certain root of an old tree, a root smoothed by decades of observation, they knew the cycle had begun. A simple ritual followed. A basket of seeds floated on the surface and sent downstream. It wasn't about where it landed. It was about knowing when to let go. The seasons turned without alarm. There was no panic in the shortening of days, only preparation. When shadows grew longer and winds colder, food was stored, fires were made ready, children were wrapped in layers of moss and fur. No one asked how long winter would last. They only said, "It has begun." And when the frost receded, it was not a surprise. It was a return. In forests deep and dark, a moss-covered stone acted as the village's timekeeper. It lay flat, round, and always damp. But when the sun struck it at a particular angle, just once a year, a pattern of lichen glowed gold. Only then would the gathering begin. Not before, not after. These people did not need calendars. They had trust. In stone, in wind, in sun, in each other. Time, in their world, was not hunted. It was welcomed, like a visitor. Sometimes early, sometimes late. Always respected. And even when a moment passed them by, a missed season, a failed crop, they did not rage. They simply waited again. Because before clocks, there was rhythm. Before time was measured, it was felt. The sky, the soil, the stars, they were all soft reminders that the world moved and would continue to move, whether counted or not. And in the quiet spaces between sunrise and sunset, between frost and bloom, people learned the most patient kind of knowing, the kind that never asks for minutes, only meaning, only moments, only the long, slow song of a world without clocks,